tonight and turn over to the book of Psalms and go to Psalm 3. Now, as we're looking through the Psalms, we will probably skip around a little bit. I was just talking to someone tonight that if we went through each one, just one a week, it would be 3 years. And then if we hit Psalm 119, that might slow us down another few weeks. And Psalm 78 might take a while. So as the Lord directs, but we're not in a hurry. But just as you read through the book of Psalms, it's hard to skip any of them because there's so much truth in each one. And as you come down to Psalm 3, and again, we could look at the makeup of this, and I think that's a good study. It's really not my purpose on Wednesday night per se, but it's worth looking at. But just about every part of the Scripture that you go through, the more you study it and compare it with other places in the Bible, and admittedly, many times I'll read behind certain men that I respect who have studied the Bible and follow the same line of thinking that I agree with. They often, in studying, will point out some of these things, but almost every passage in the Old Testament has a prophetic aspect and, of course, a very local aspect, what was going on at that very time, and then something very practical that you can apply to yourself. Now, I think as you look at the first 8 Psalms, I think you can make an argument there that there is a prophetic aspect as Jesus is introduced as that example of that blessed man. And then, of course, we see all three, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost in Psalm 2 like we saw before. Well, now we turn over to the persecution, which all 5 of these next Psalms have to do with difficulty that they're going through until you get to Psalm 8. And so they do kind of fit together. They do form an octave, in a sense, these first 8 Psalms. And again, not something I would see surface, but I read behind someone, H.A. Ironside, it pointed that out, and sometimes people stretch a point, but as you study it and you look at it, you can't help but marvel at how the Bible is put together. I can assure you the editor, and I say that in quotes, of the book of Psalms, whoever compiled it, whatever the human hands were that compiled this book, had no idea that the first 8 Psalms formed an octave. God put it down there. The Holy Spirit, of course, is the ultimate editor, and He paints a picture. So I can open up a part of the Bible like Psalm 3. I can be in a difficulty, going through trouble, read this psalm, and my heart can be encouraged. God, I'm going through trouble too. And who hadn't gone to the Psalms for comfort and to be in a very practical way can read every verse and think, boy, that's the prayer of my heart. And at the same time, see a prophetic picture of the remnant of the Jews during the tribulation period praying the same prayer, looking for their king to come, and then to know that even in the same sense that God paints an overall picture and it all fits together like a puzzle, I mean, the Bible is a remarkable book. But even a child can go to Psalm 3 and can read it and find comfort for his heart. So you go to Psalm 3 and you'll notice here, it's a prayer and it's described in the title, a Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Now, you know the context of that story. Absalom, of course, had rebelled, had killed his brother, and for a while was gone. David brought him back, and from a distance, and when he brought him back reluctantly, Absalom began to steal the heart of the people, and he began to flatter them, and he began to be sort of like a politician, and he had everybody getting behind him, and he waited for that day, and he was going to rebel and overthrow the king, which was his father. Well, David didn't see it coming. And of course, for a short time, he was removed from Jerusalem, was out in the wilderness. His son literally had the city of Jerusalem under his control. And the next day were going to get an army to go out and just try to destroy David and his mighty men. Well, of course, God overcame that, put David back in the city. But really the picture here, if you can picture David out as they took him outside the city to a safe place. All of the men are encamped in one place, and then they put David off by himself to keep him safe. And he's there laying under the stars that night, thinking that his kingdom has just been rent away from him. And yet he prays this prayer and places it in context. So as you see David, you understand what he means in verse 1. Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Well, that was including his son and all the host. It says, many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God, Selah. I mean, David writes this under distress and is in the midst of a deep trouble, and yet what was David told? When David was put on that throne, God came to him and met with him early on and said, your throne is going to be an everlasting throne. So you might be gone for a brief time. I mean, David at this point really has been overthrown. But David knows ultimately, God told me my throne was going to last forever. I mean, he's going to send, when he told that, David prayed something similar to the Lord. Lord, you have spoken of my kingdom for time to come. He knew ultimately God was going to do that. And isn't that true in our life? We know ultimately God's going to deliver. But still, when you're in the difficulty, it's still difficult. So that's where David is. Now, notice several things about this. And again, there's so many different truths here, but just in a very practical way. The first thing I see here is he had many enemies. Now, think about the enemy here, because what you have is an increase of enemies. He says, how are they increased that trouble me? Do you know David was supposed to be on the throne? For a brief period, he was removed from that throne, and Absalom, the rebel, came in and took the throne. Now, Absalom didn't do a very good job, and his kingdom was brief, and his rule was brief, and his reign was brief, but he caused quite a bit of havoc. I mean, it really stirred things up and really was never the same when David came back. Some of the counselors had demonstrated they were rebellious. The cabinet was different. His ministers were different. There was just a number of things that it caused, but ultimately David came back. But what does that remind us of? See, we have a king right now, and the king is not really sitting on his legitimate throne on this earth. Now, he is obviously sitting on the throne in heaven. But right now on this earth, I don't have to convince you. If I do, you're really not familiar with the conditions. Jesus is not running this world system. If he was, it surely wouldn't be in the shape that it's in. For a short time, Absalom is on the throne, and Jesus is removed. Now, he's not under any threat from Absalom. You might wonder sometimes if you looked at it as an outsider and thought, well, is the devil winning? He's not winning. Jesus is going to set up a throne on this earth. He's going to be in charge. But right now, as the believer, do you not have to pray with David? Many are increased that trouble me. You know, the devil is like a magician. Now, he is undoubtedly powerful. But you know, as I read the Bible, I do not find the power of the devil emphasized. Now, I'm not saying he doesn't have supernatural ability. Well, you know what I find more that the devil was able to do than really, we talk about God's power. His power is magnificent. I don't see the devil's power emphasized. I see his deception emphasized. So you know what the devil may well have done? He may have deceived us into thinking he's more powerful than he really is. Maybe we give him too much credit. Now, the Bible does give him, if I can say, credit for being a master deceiver. So do you not feel sometimes like, boy, I'm telling you, they are increased that trouble me. Is there anybody else who still stands for the Word of God and good and right? Are we the only people that are really trying to do this, and are we even serious about it? That's a deception of the devil. God's still got people on this earth. The gospel's still working. People still get saved. Jesus' blood is still sufficient. The devil is not going to win. He knows ultimately he's going to lose. Now, Jesus even told us broad is the way that leads to destruction. Sure, there's plenty of lost people out there, and God's not even taken back or surprised when we know Romans chapter 1 says when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful. They're going to suppress the truth. All of that's the case, but the devil takes what is truth and he adds just enough error to discourage us. Yeah, many there be that trouble me. They're increased, but the devil is not ultimately going to be in charge. You know, I notice as well that along with the devil being in charge, he says, the folks that trouble me are increased. Many are they that rise up against me. You know, trouble is part of being in a world that is fallen by sin and run by the devil. Now, Job knew something about trouble. It's no accident that that was the first book in the Bible. You know, God could have waited till the 1st century A.D. and wrote Job. He could have helped Job just as much in A.D. 100, right after the book of Revelation was written, and said, boy, I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to put a man under some deep persecution, and he's not going to know what's going on. Do you know nothing supernatural took place in the book of Job? I mean, it was just natural occurrences as far as Job was concerned. Now, it was too much of a coincidence not to be God's providence. All in the same day, the wind knocks the house down, kills the kids, people steal the cattle. Not too long after, of course, boils come on his body. I mean, when something like that happens, it's not technically supernatural, but you say that's too big of an accident for God not to be in it. God had to be in it. But nothing, no miracle took place per se in the book of Job in that way, of course, until God comes on the scene and speaks to him out of the whirlwind. Now, my point being, God could have had that book written in the 1st century A.D., and it would have been a great encouragement to mankind, but it just so happens that was the first one that he wrote down for man to have. You think it's come in handy over the years? You think God's people have ever taken the book of Job, not just in this century, but some 3,000 years ago and said, boy, if Job could handle that and God was with him, I believe God will be with me too. I mean, that tells me there's a loving God who wanted his people to know that, yes, there is going to be trouble, but don't worry, I am behind it. I know what's going on. Yes, there's a devil, and sometimes I do give him enough rope to hang himself, but in the end, I'm going to be with you. Now, the book of Job is a tremendous book, but you know how long it lasts? About a year. Job lived to be a pretty old man. All in all, he ended up with double of everything he had before. Double the kids, double the wealth. I mean, everything. And Job, when it was all said and done, never really understood why it happened, but he was able to certainly say with confidence, blessed be the name of the Lord. Now, the world is going to have trouble. Jesus said something similar in the New Testament. In the world you shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. So David recognizes there's going to be many enemies. They're going to increase. But then notice in verse 2 the ignorance of these enemies. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. Now, it's one thing for the world to look at you and say, we're going to beat you. But you know what the message from the world is? And the devil knows that this is the message. He tries to pull the rug out from under us spiritually. You can handle almost anything physically if you're able to be sustained spiritually. But the devil tries to pull the rug out from under you spiritually. It'd be one thing if it read like this: many there be which say of me, there is no help for him. That's just somebody's opinion, which this is their opinion as well, but they go a step further. There is no help for your soul in God. But you know, there is help for my soul in God. Say what they will, there is help for my soul. Why does the world care if I believe this Bible is the Word of God? I mean, why does it bother them that I believe that I was created, put on this earth, and I want to teach my kids there's a Creator and I'm accountable to Him, when history has proven everywhere this book goes, the world is better? I mean, I know it's true, but let's suppose that we just say for sake of argument today that it wasn't. Everywhere it's gone, it's improved the world. If just from a practical standpoint, somebody says, you know, I don't really believe the Bible's true, but I'll tell you what, everywhere people teach that, people live a better life, get along better, live healthier lives, don't kill each other off, create pretty strong families, the society works well. Hey, I don't believe it's there, but man, let's let people propagate it. But you know as well as I do, they don't do that, which is one reason if it wasn't true, they would do that. Because if it wasn't true, it wouldn't have that kind of power. But the fact is, it is fought against. Why is it fought against? Because the devil wants to know, for the one that would stand up against him, he'd love for you to think there is no help for you in God. Your soul isn't going to be improved at all. You're on your own. You know, if the devil can ever get you to believe you're on your own, he's got you discouraged. I mean, if I know God's with me, I don't mean just theoretically, when I sense it. God is with me. That's when you can make it. You can handle it if God's with you. You and God make a majority in any community. So David sees these enemies, knows what they say, but you know, even though he had many enemies, he magnified the Lord. Look, if you would, down here in verse 3. But thou, O Lord, art a shield. I like the but, because David is saying, yeah, I know what they say. However, here's the greater truth. But thou art, Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of mine head. You know, God is a shield. The imagery, of course, for the time in which David lived, it was a very military-oriented society. Most of your kings and kingdoms, as soon as men got old enough, they were going to serve in the military. And, of course, David knew something about armor. He knew about the shield. And, of course, when he was so young, he couldn't even prove the armor of Saul. But in his sense, he didn't need a shield that day, a physical shield. He didn't even take one. He didn't even take the armor. He just took a bag of stones and a sling. He didn't even need the other 4, for that matter. He took 5 and only needed one of them. But he did not need a shield because God is his shield. Right. Now, he said, thou art my shield and my glory. Now, what is our glory? You know, I guess glory, and if I could just kind of put it in this sense, it's almost, and this is not really accurate, but it helps you to see what it's saying, what you would brag about. What would I brag about today about me? There's only one thing I can brag about, me, is that I'm in Him. Paul said it like this, in my flesh dwelleth no good thing, but I am what I am by the grace of God. In a sense, I can, and again, I'm using this just in a vernacular to understand what I mean, because it's really not an accurate term, but I can brag today about myself because I'm in Him. He is my glory. I have some glory. I happen to be a joint heir with Jesus Christ. That's pretty important, isn't it? You know, people talk about not having any self-esteem. Most people's problem is they have too much esteem. Now, take away your own self-esteem, and I'll tell you what the right kind of self-esteem. He is my glory. He is the one I can brag on, and I'm connected to Him. But David didn't say, I'm bragging on Him from a distance. He's not even talking about God's glory. He's my glory, the lifter up of my head. You ever need your head lifted up? Now, I can't say, you know, if that specifically he's thinking, because we think of it in this way, it certainly makes sense. But I think when somebody drops their head, I think of discouragement. They look down. You look down because you're discouraged. Well, Jesus is the lifter up of my head. Most of the time when you think of lifting up the head in the Bible, you think about somebody who's executed. They lift up their head off to Him, but David didn't mean that, I don't believe. I believe He's my glory. He's the one that lifts me up, encourages me, causes me to look up. He is my shield. Psalm 84:11 says, the Lord God is a sun and a shield. No good thing will He withhold from them that walk uprightly. He goes on to say in verse 4, I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and He heard me out of His holy hill. You know, there's nothing in the Bible that says that when a person truly trusts the Lord and you really have faith, you're going through something like David's going through. Here you are, Absalom's in the throne. God didn't expect David to say, okay, guys, let's go and head out of town. I know I'll be back in a couple of days. God told me that I was going to be the king. No need. Hey, don't worry about it, guys. No need to weep. Don't worry about that. You guys act like you're upset. Hey, trust God. With a smile on His face, not a bit of concern. There's nothing in the Bible that says that is a demonstration of faith. You know what he did when he got put out? He cried unto the Lord. Doesn't it make sense that sometimes God allows us to go through difficulty so we'll cry unto Him? It doesn't show a lack of faith for me to fall on my face and say, God, I'm not sure what's going on here. There is I guess an element, if you think about it, there's an element where David was saying, I don't know what's going to happen. I can't understand. I'm bothered. We are, after all, very human. I mean, God knows our frame. He remembers that we're but dust. If God had just saved us and so glorified us and so instilled faith in us, no, come what may, I mean, David would have just said, okay, put me on the chariot and drive me out of town. Matter of fact, I'm not even going to leave town. Absalom can put a sword right in my gullet if he wants to. My kingdom's going to last forever. Well, we're not cut out that way. No pun intended. We are people who have human element that says, I don't know what's going to happen. But here's the mistake. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm going to despair. The right way is, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm going to turn to one who knows what's going to happen. And he cried unto the Lord. Well, he did. You expect the next part. He heard me out of his holy hill. Psalm 46:1, he is a very present help in trouble. You know, God likes for us to get in trouble because he can help us. Now, he doesn't have to put us into trouble. I said he likes for us to get in it. You know how we get in it? 2 ways. The devil and us. A lot of times it's us. Sometimes the devil doesn't have to bother with us because we're so good at it ourselves. But he can give you a push if he needs to. But God likes to hear us when we're in trouble because he likes to show he can bring us out. So David already knew he was heard. Now, I like verse 5 because it proves that God is also a sustainer. He said, I laid me down and slept. I awake, for the Lord sustained me. Now he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord heard him. I know he's writing this probably in retrospect, but you says Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom. He may well have wrote it in the midst of the trial. It's very likely that he could have. Even so, the context is he prayed, he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord heard him. He said the Lord heard him when he was still out in the wilderness and Absalom was still in Jerusalem. You know that's how God answers prayer? God will answer the prayer before it actually physically takes place. And he can let you know he did. What do you think the peace of God is? God can give you peace of what he's going to do. Now, he didn't know how. Maybe he just could have said, well, the Lord heard me. Maybe that means he's going to make a whole new kingdom for me. Maybe he's, Absalom's going to stay there. And he didn't know what the answer was. He just knew God's going to answer. So you know what happened? He went to sleep. You ever had a hard time going to sleep? Now, you can have physical problems, have a hard time going to sleep. But I don't know about you, but I've experienced it many times. The worst night's sleep you ever have, or the lack thereof, is when you can't get your mind to stop. Amen. You can't slow it down. Amen. What kind of things might be going through David's mind that night? Man, I don't know what's going to happen to me. And then, of course, Absalom, from his heart, he didn't want him to kill Absalom. I mean, he was upset when they killed him. My own son's up there, and it's about half my fault anyway. I fell into sin. My daughter went through this, and now my son's killed. Now Absalom's run out on me. All this stuff's going through his mind. But when he turned it over to God, he said, I laid down and I went to sleep. Slept all night, and I woke up. You know why I woke up the next morning? Because he sustained me. Amen. Now let me tell you what sustain. You know what it means, but biblically, think about it. How does God sustain me? That means an ongoing keeping up. Well, Paul the Apostle found out when he prayed about that thorn in the flesh, he wanted a one-time help. I got a thorn in the flesh. God, you're all powerful. I'm tired of dealing with it. If you'll remove that, then I can get done better what I want to do. God said, no, you can't. You'll be better if you got to pray about this every day. You'll do better if you find out that not only removing that would just be a one-time thing. I can do better than that. Come what may, I can give you grace that is sufficient to overcome it. Amen. You know, as much as you might rather feel better about it for the moment if God would just overcome it and take it away and I don't have to deal with it anymore. But he knows we're better off if he gives us sustaining grace. What did the old adage, you give a man a certain amount of food or whatever, feed him one time, but if you teach him how to plant food, he can feed himself for the rest of his life. That's the principle. God says, look, you're better off if I just keep giving you what you need when you need it, because it's an unending amount that God can give. So he sustained him. Now, you have David here who recognizes he's got many enemies. Then David magnifies the Lord, talks about all that God did for him. Then the final part of this, he has marvelous confidence. If you'll notice in verse 6, I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. Now, not just 10,000, but 10,000s. That's basically a superlative. Like when we say, millions, or we say, use some kind of a ridiculous number. That's what or David is saying. I won't be afraid of 10,000s of people. Doesn't make any difference. When you're talking about coming up against God, how many does it matter? I mean, he said, many arise up against me. How many are intimidating to God? Not 10,000s, not billions. There's no amount of enemies that are intimidating to God. I mean, God's going to face the biggest war that he'll ever face in Gog and Magog, more than likely, at the end of the millennium. Now, he'll face a large army at the end of the tribulation. You know, it's interesting to read about that war. Jesus comes down out of heaven. All of the armies are gathered at Armageddon to the valley, which, by the way, is exactly where God said they were going to go. You'd almost think the devil and his forces would have read it ahead of time and say, well, I mean, God said if we go there, that's where he's going to go exactly where God says he's going to go. He comes down out of heaven with saints and angels and so forth, and we're all watching. Maybe you think, well, we're going to be armed for battle, and boy, it's going to really be a big battle that day. I can almost see if Hollywood tried to make a movie about Armageddon, what they make it look like. It ain't going to be much. I mean, he, with the word of his mouth, gets to wherever he wants to get to, whether it's halfway down. We know he's going to put his feet on the Mount of Olives, and he says, okay, I'm in the exact place, I'm there. I mean, it may be billions. I mean, right now there's 8 billion people in the world. We're multiplying pretty rapidly, and who knows when the tribulation takes place, could be billions of people, and speaks the word, wipes them out. Now, they don't just disappear. It makes sense why the blood comes up to the horse's bridle. I mean, he's going to wipe them out. He uses the imagery, and I don't hesitate to do it because the Bible does, of treading out grapes. Now, you picture that, if you want, with billions of people and God treading out grapes. You say, man, that sounds terrible, but who do we have? We have these enemies who've stood up and said there is no help for him in God. Who is God to tell us what to do? We're rebels against him. Now, I'm glad tonight to be on the side of the one who's coming down to put his foot on that mountain. Amen. David had confidence. Who cares if it's 10,000, 10 billion? It doesn't make any difference to me. He says, they set themselves around, verse 7, arise, O Lord, save me. O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. You know, smiting them on the cheekbone may well have to do with, again, the imagery. And again, you're using the same phrase here, but smiting on the cheekbone may be a slap. That's humiliation. Breaking their teeth is a knockout blow. You don't break somebody's teeth from just slapping them like I don't like you. When he breaks their teeth, that's a hard hit. Okay? So what he basically does, comes up and whacks them and says, you're humiliated. Who are you? And then the next one is a knockout. Now, I'm not saying God's going to throw the blow, but that's the imagery he's using. He's thinking hand-to-hand combat. That's the military that David's used to. So here's a guy who's so overcoming, so overwhelming as a conqueror, that he first of all basically spits in your face, and then if you try to come back against him, he just kills you. He's saying that God is an overcoming conqueror against his enemy. Now, do remember, when you read the Psalms, and you're going to see some of these if Jesus gives us opportunity and tarries and we continue to look, we have what we call imprecatory Psalms. God, I want you to smite them hip and thigh. I want you to... Okay, God is giving an image there of Israel, who are an earthly people who dealt with a land, and you're dealing with invaders to that land that are going against the covenant of God. It's not for the Christian to say, well, we just need to pray that God would send all these people to hell. We'd be there too if it wasn't for Jesus. You don't get that. He's not talking about his enemies, that God is somehow not giving the man who doesn't believe the Bible an opportunity to be saved. Not at all. We're not looking at an individual man as the enemy. The enemy is not a man. By the way, we're all cousins anyway, right? We're all part of Adam. We're part of that group of men. It is the devil and his kingdom. It is those that follow him. It is the system. Now, he so affects some men that you think there's not too much difference between them and the devil because they're energized by him. Judas Iscariot was taken over by him. I mean, he even influenced Peter at a point, but ultimately he's the enemy. Through death, he destroyed him that had the power of death, that is the devil. So we look beyond just a physical enemy. Hey, I got a neighbor who's giving me all kinds of problems and he's difficult. I'm going to just pray God will smite him hip and thigh. Now, why don't you pray God will smite his heart and save him and make a new creature out of him? What a testimony to God that would be. You know, I've prayed for some famous people before to be saved. I mean, I've thought, wouldn't it be a testimony? It'd be one thing if they dropped dead of a heart attack. I can't tell you in my own carnality, I hadn't thought about that too. But anyway, I've said, God, if you were to save that person, as wicked as they are, and they were to turn around and testify, I know God. And by the way, he's done that before. He's done it in people's hearts. Even if he doesn't, God's almighty, he's going to get the glory. But there's really a greater testimony to God turning a man's will around and saving him than even if he just took him off the scene. Well, David is saying, defeat the enemy. The enemy is the devil. You know what will save you from getting bitter? Is remember who your enemy is. It's not your wife. It's not your husband. It's not your neighbor. It's not your parents. We love to put it on a person. The enemy is the devil. Right. And by the way, I believe you can hate him all you want to. Right. That's no problem. You can not forgive the devil if you don't want to. I mean, he can be the object of it because he ultimately is opposed to God. So he says he smote him. And then last of all, in verse 8, salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people. You know why he could have confidence? Because he knew what God's reputation was. You know what God's reputation is? Save people. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. And then, of course, he's saying, thy blessing is upon thy people. That was the Jewish people, but you know who God's people are is anybody who knows him. Is God's blessing not on his people? I mean, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. I mean, God has a reputation, and that reputation has always stood the test of time. He blesses his people. He blesses them. It is a blessing to know God. I don't mean just a giddy feeling. I mean God literally puts divine favor on his people. That's God's reputation. You know why I'm not worried? I'm not anxious about who's going to win the election? Because I'm one of God's people. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't see the potential for difficulty. It doesn't mean that I couldn't be like David and fall on my face and pray and say, God, here's something that I'm concerned about. It doesn't mean that I stick my head in the sand and say it doesn't matter anyway. No, it matters, but God is over matter. I mean, God makes things matter. And so salvation belongs to him. He blesses his people. There's been people all since Jesus came out of the grave who've had persecutors and had people that didn't like them, but God's always been with them, and he's going to be with us. And so David, of course, we know the end of the story. He gets restored to his kingdom. Absalom, of course, is taken out. The enemies are put down, and God did what he said he was going to do. Let's go ahead and stop there tonight.